guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. This is a historical fiction novel set in the 1970s, around 5 girls who eventually wind up killing themselves. The story is told from the perspective of the neighborhood boys in the first person plural. I gave this book 4 stars. This was a reread for me, and I will say that when I first read this book, I read it in high school and I absolutely adored every second of it. Part of that does still hold up today. I think Eugenides' prose is beautiful. I adore his writing style. It's so easy to get absorbed into his words. He's very descriptive and very detailed about everything important, but every word he uses matters. He never has any kind of extraneous detail. Everything is relevant to the story, and I think because of that, it's so easy to get sucked in. A fair amount of the time with books that are very descriptive, I do feel like they're describing unnecessary things. They're just describing things in order to describe things. But in this book, every word has purpose. Every description means something, and I adore that. I also think that the historical fiction element is done very well. This is set in the 1970s, and it was published in the 1990s, so there's not much removal there. But unlike some historical fiction novels, this genuinely feels like the time. It doesn't feel like he's trying too hard to make it feel like the 1970s. He doesn't need to reference a lot of pop culture or a lot of historical events from the time. It just feels like the 70s. You get a sense of time from his writing and from the characters. It feels so natural and it flows so well with the story. It never feels jarring. It's just lovely in that way. But the problems I have with this book are kind of undeniable. They mostly revolve around toxic masculinity and the male gaze. And there is some question with how intentional he's being with those things. Is he actually using toxic masculinity and writing about toxic masculinity intentionally, or is it just a part of this story? And I do think I am conflicted on that, which is a failure in the writing itself. In regards to the male gaze, the boys don't treat the girls like they're real people. They treat them as ideas of people. They're manic pixie dream girls to them. And it's kind of hard when reading it to decide how much is Jeffrey Eugenides making a point of this, and he's pointing this out in the story, and how much of it just is the story. And I really was conflicted on that because I couldn't tell. There were some points when it felt like he was calling it out and he was making a point of it, and that was the intention of his writing this book. But there were other points where it didn't feel intentional, and I was very torn on that. I think in the end, I did kind of decide, especially by the way this book ended, that it wasn't intentional, at least not throughout this whole book. But I do think a lot of the book can be read that way. If you're actively choosing to read it like that, a good portion of this book can be read as though it was intentional. But I don't know that I would give Eugenides credit for that. And I also don't know how much of that is my love for this book as a teenager just carrying over and the nostalgia making me look at it kind of with rose-colored glasses. I really can't separate my feelings for this book as a teenager from my feelings for it now, and I do think that makes me love this book more than I might otherwise. But that is the reason I knocked it down to 4 stars. The girls are so poorly treated throughout this book, by both the boys and by the narration itself. For a lot of this book, they are kind of homogenous. They don't have distinct personalities. And then even once they get distinct personalities, they're oftentimes not positive. Cecilia, who is the youngest and the first to commit suicide, is often painted as a copycat or a silly girl with a crush, or just too odd for this world. But it feels like there's a lot more depth to her character, and I can't decide if Jeffrey Eugenides was writing it that way, if he was writing Cecilia as this complex, dark character, or if that's just my perspective in reading this book. At their school, a boy jumps off the roof to proclaim his love for a girl who's moved away. And because Cecilia also jumps off the roof, there are a lot of parallels drawn between the two events, but the boy was explicitly doing it because he loved a girl who left. And he's also shown as kind of being silly in a way. He survives, he's fine, and he gets over the girl very quickly after that. Whereas Cecilia, although the boys describe her as being very similar to that she has a silly crush on him, that she's just copying him, that she's just a little kid, it does feel like she has a lot more depth to her character. Right before she commits suicide, the boys who are narrating this book are making fun of a local neighborhood boy with disabilities, and they're calling him Joe the Retard. and right after that, Cecilia commits suicide. And Jeffrey Eugenides is so sparse with his words and sparse with everything in this book that everything matters, and it's hard not to see that as intentional. They also discuss her journal at a point in this book, and describe her journal as being full of things about the environment and dying whales and things like that. And it does feel like it's intentional within the narration. It feels intentional within the narration, even though it goes over the boys' heads. And I appreciated that. It felt at times like it was making a point that these girls were characters, that these girls were real people, and the boys of the neighborhood weren't getting it. But there were other points where it felt like it was disregarding that entirely, that either Jeffrey Eugenides was failing to do it, or that when he did it, it was an accident. And I'm very conflicted over that. I don't really know exactly what my final thoughts are. I've been thinking about this book for a while, and I'm not sure, but it is interesting, and I think it depends a lot on how you're reading this book and how you're looking at it. Which, again, I think is a failure in the writing, because I think it should be clear. But at the end of the day, even with my issues, I love his writing style. I think his writing is beautiful, and that really makes this book for me. I think it's incredibly worthwhile for his writing, and I'm interested to read or reread some of his other books and see if I find fewer issues in those, perhaps. I'm not entirely sure that I will, because I've heard some negative things about his other books, but I do really enjoy his writing style. Let me know down below if you've read The Virgin Suicides and what you thought of it if you have. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.